Chapter 3. The morning was calm. It was still dark when I woke up. I sat at this desk and began to edit what I wrote the last night. A few elk made their way into the backyard as dawn approached. I lit a cigarette and watched the male and the three females search through the fresh snow for grass. I went downstairs as Ashton began to wake. I made coffee and brought 2 cups into the room. Ashton laid nude, partially entwined in sheets. Grim was resting by her feet. I put her cup of coffee beside her. "Good morning, my love," she said as she sat up and stretched her arms around me. The blanket fell behind her. "Here's your coffee," I said as I handed her the mug. She walked over to the window with nothing but her cup. She stood by the glass watching the elk delicately make their way across the yard. She took out a couple of cigarettes from her bag and sat in the chair next to the open window. "Cigarette?" she asked softly as she lit 2. I pulled up a chair next to the window and smoked with her. We sat and waited with our coffee, while we woke up with the sun. The rays of light began to dimly illuminate our room. Ashton began to read what I wrote last night, also editing it along the way. When she was done, she got up from her chair and walked into the bathroom. "I'm going to shower," she said, as she stood in the bathroom doorway with a grin, well aware I was staring at her naked body. "I'll be here," I responded with a smile as I took another drag of my cigarette. I turned on the TV and put it on the news. I sat at my desk until Ashton got out of the shower. She put on a record and sat in front of the mirror to do her makeup. I left the bathroom door open so I could hear the horns. About halfway through my shower, I began to feel ill. There was a large pit in my stomach. I threw up once I got out of the tub. I brushed my teeth and shaved before I left the bathroom. Ashton sat in the same position before the mirror, staring at herself. But her reflection was staring at me. Her head facing forward, the eyes looking over at mine. A glare so deeply apathetic, a glare I have not seen before. The eyes. They did not belong to her. I walked over and shook her from her glare and brought her to the chair next to the window. A lipstick streak ran up her lip. The pit in my stomach grew stronger. I did the best I could to stay calm as I gave her water. It took a little bit before she began to speak normally. She was not sure what happened after I explained it. After a couple of cups of water, she got up and got dressed. We grabbed the leash for Grim before we got into the truck. The sun was hidden by a thick low cloud and was not present enough to melt the snow. The sky was dark gray, the day is foggy and cold. We backed out of the driveway and onto the street. We stopped at the gas station so Ashton could grab another pack of cigarettes before turning onto Jericho. I put some gas in and scrapped the rest of the frost off the windshield. Ashton got back in the cab and put the Ramones cassette in the dash player. Pet Sematary was the first song on. No words, just large smiles came from both of us. Her hand found its way into mine, her touch spoke in its delicate way. Her hands are cold, her nose is flushed. "I don't want to be buried in a pet cemetery, don't want to live my life again," she sang softly as she remains fixed on the trees while looking out the window. I pulled off at the chain station so I could grab my other coat. I walked around and adjusted the chains the best I could without freezing my hands off. We waited for the plow to get in front of us before we got back onto Jericho. After a few miles, we approached the part of the road where Ms. Bringston had her accident. We pulled over for a moment. The scene had been cleaned up. There were lumps of sand and cat litter still on the road from when the fire department covered up the oil and gasoline. It is chilling knowing that not many people will ever know what happened here, but they will drive by it every day. We turned down the player and sat on a nearby rock in silence. We smoked a cigarette while the wind blew against our backs. Ashton took out a flask and took a few swigs before pouring some out over the rocks. A few minutes later the cassette started to rewind, the volume began to fluctuate. The tape stopped on the Pet Sematary track again. The smell of death is all around, and the night, when the cold wind blows, no one cares, no one knows. These 4 lines were on repeat. The volume would drop, then turn itself up again. Shortly after the tape would stop, rewind, then play that part of the song, only to stop, rewind and repeat. Once we began walking back to the truck the radio stopped. As we drove off, Ashton switched our player to the radio. We made our way to the Café Diamond in North Oak. The roads are very narrow. This time of day we usually have to park a few blocks away during the week because parking is shit. We cut through a couple of alleyways, past some small businesses, restaurants, and the bank. The street lamps were being lit again by the lamplighters because of how dark the sky got when the low clouds rolled in. The snowplows were clearing the streets. A man with a saxophone played Christmas-like songs on the corner. We were 2 of 5 people in the shop today. Ed, Jake, and Kendall were on their way. They are on their way back from dropping Taylor off at school. I'm sure they're on their way back. Our favorite barista is working today, Jennifer. Aren't you supposed to be in school? Jennifer asked, placing our mugs in front of us. We have to take a personal day, I responded as politely as I could. You hear what happened here last night? Jennifer replied as she brought herself to eye level at the edge of our table. No, Ashton responded. Another child went missing last night. They said Emily was taken from her bed sometime after sundown. The windows and doors were all locked, but Emily was nowhere to be found. Of course the locals are saying it's Yan, but I think we have a predator in our town, she stated as she stood up from the table. Obviously it is not Yan, he's long dead by now, I responded. Of course silly, but you know how the locals get about such a thing, Jennifer replied. Yan is a well-known name in North Oak. He used to be one of the lamplighters decades ago. A tall, rugged man, by the name of Yandel, used to live here in North Oak around the 1920s. He was loved and respected by most until he started displaying abnormal behavior. He was not pleasant to be around anymore and became increasingly violent. After a few children and 7 women disappeared, he was exiled with no proof he was involved. He built a shack cabin, hidden in the woods. He has been there ever since. He would always carry a lantern. Anyone who ever encountered him knew him to always be holding it. He never put it down and it always stayed lit. The string of murders started a few months after he left. Bodies would wind up mutilated and mangled hanging from the trees in the center of town. Some of the most disturbing scenarios anyone has ever seen in our county. Patrons of the town reported symbols carved into the carcass, with branches shoved into the eyes. It was not common for limbs and heads to be found hanging in the trees or placed on the doorsteps of the family. When the people of the town went out to search for Yan, all they found was a lone shack, 2 miles into the Northridge forest. People have seen the glow from his lantern walk through the trees at night but could never see his figure. The murders continued for years, then stopped suddenly. The population of North Oak fell to 37 people. Parents now use the legend of Old Yandel to scare kids into coming home before the sun goes down. It's always been a well-known statement. Do not go into the Northridge woods alone. Every town in Northridge County is surrounded by the thick pine forest. It is hard to stay out of them. It sounds like a predator, I responded as I watched Ed, Jake and Kendall walk into the entrance of the cafe. After they found their seats at our table, Jennifer proceeded to take their orders. You ready for tonight? Ed said, taking off his backpack and pulling out his pack of grits. I'm excited, like a teenage virgin in an all-boys Catholic school, Jake said as he took a seat. Fuck yeah. I'm so ready, I responded. I charged every battery and I got more film for the cameras, Ed added. Kendall sat down next to Ashton. Ed said he came up with a plan but wouldn't tell us in the car. Kendall stated, looking over at Ed. Tell us. Jake stated. Ed took out a map that he printed from home. Some parts were already highlighted with a marker. We should leave my house around 11 p.m. tonight. We can all meet at my place at 10 and pack up the last of what we need. Jake is going to carry the tools this time. I am going to carry a rope and the bolt cutters. Forrest, you carry the radio box, batteries, spray paint, and candles. We have to cut the chain to the gate once we get there. After we drive on a small road for half a mile before we reach the first building. We want to get into Building 3, Building 4, and Building 5. Those are the main housing units on the property. We might have to bring a pole or crowbar to get the sheet of wood off the side window if there are any, Ed said, grabbing his coffee. I can do that, Jake said with a smile. We sound like a fucking tactical team, I stated as we all laughed. I'm so stoked, Ed said, putting his map back in his backpack. Willow Creek looks pretty insane, Jake said, looking over at Kendall. Jennifer approached our table with more cups of coffee. You better not be going where I think you're going, she said with a hint of concern. Where do you think we are going? Ed responded. You're going to want to talk to someone before going into the institution, she said, looking at the 5 of us. She took a moment, then grabbed a pen and paper from her back pocket. Her home might be a little hard to find, but it's here in North Oak. She lives alone, in a cabin about 2 miles from here. She is a native to the land. Treat her with respect. "You need to talk to her before you go," she said with a serious tone. She wrote down a name and the address, then handed it to Ed. The paper read, Blanca, 517 Hilltop Drive. Along with the phone number. "Don't do anything you'll regret, ladies and gentlemen," she said as she walked back to the register. The five of us stayed for a couple more hours before leaving. We agreed to meet up again at Ed's house before sundown so we could call Blanca before we go to Willow Creek. On our way home, we passed the scene again. The fog was heavy, the snow had stopped. As we approached the scene, Pet Sematary by the Ramones started sounding from the dash player. "I don't want to live my life again." Ashton squeezed my hand as we passed by. I kicked the tape out and turned it back to the radio. The pit in my stomach returned, the hairs on my neck stood up. Ashton lit 2 cigarettes as we drove down Jericho. I had a feeling I haven't had in a long time. This feeling wasn't new to either of us, but when it was present, it was obvious and distracting. We had to slow down gradually because the snow was falling harder and covering the road. I could see the flashing yellow lights that illuminated the chain station. I pulled over and pulled my hazard bag from behind my seat. Ashton grabbed another set of chains from the bag and put them on her side. The hazard lights from the snowplow could be seen through the fog, a far length ahead of us rounding the corner of the mountain. It took us a while, but eventually, we made it to our turn. We drove down our street, pulled into our driveway. We both sat in a little silence after I turned off the engine. Something was not right. Something felt off. We walked in the front door and found some pictures had fallen on the floor. The television was on. Grim was sitting in the corner, looking up at the corner of the wall. The house phone rang as we searched through the rooms. "Let it ring, my love," Ashton said as we picked the pictures off the ground and hung them back on the wall. Every picture that had fallen had me somewhere in it. The photos of my grandparents remained untouched. The voicemail tone went off once again. No one left a message.